Hey everybody, this is Susan Kokinda. I hope you subscribe, comment, and like Crypto Rich.
What is going on with Greenland? When is Trump going to invade Greenland and how? What will NATO do? That's what we're going to be talking about in this video. Hey Alex, hey Susan, hey Tom. Thank you so much for guys having this conversation again. We've had a conversation. We've recorded a video on what's going on in Iran. We've recorded a video on Trump appearing at the WEF and some of the domestic policies and what's happening with Canada. And here we're going to be talking about Greenland. And I have all the links in the description below. And people should know that I do these conversations with these three together once a month. And then I try and grab them for other conversations during the month anyway. All right. Tom, when is Trump going to land Marines on Greenland?
I don't think he's going to need Marines. I think like a bunch of deer hunters and a sled dog team of and a couple and a couple of Great Pyrenees to take over City Hall. I think it'll be done. The truth is that he's already offered. I think it's funny, like, oh, he's going to invade Greenland and that'll be the end of NATO and blah, blah. I'm like, oh my God. Then like 2 days. And again, like we were talking about in the last one we did about, Reza Pahlavi, putting him in charge in Iran, or, Maria Machado in Venezuela, like, he's going to invade Greenland. And then he comes out and says, how about I give everybody $100,000 and like, if we just buy you people off and be done with it. It's just hilarious. It really was. I was like, that was beautiful, man. This is beautiful. And the reality is that I don't even think the Danes are all that upset about the idea, because Trump is clearly not going to invade. And he's going to buy the thing off, or he's going to make a deal with Denmark. One of the things that, with the way he's actually dealing with the Greenland thing has added the idea that he might be trying to save Denmark as well as the Commonwealth from itself, from the rest of Europe. Denmark's still a monarchy, right? Technically, right? So there was the hugely funny thing going around all week with the idea that he should marry Baron Trump off to the princess, and that's how the Americans take Greenland. Which again, we're all joking about this, but there's a certain amount of he's using kind of the existing legal arguments of the rules-based order against them in order to craft solutions. So looking at Venezuela, by keeping keeping the existing regime in power and assisting their transition. What is he doing? He's defanging their arguments that this is a regime change operation. No, this was just we're removing Nicolas Maduro. And it's almost, in many ways, it looks like they're setting up the same kind of thing, potentially, depending on how, the dice roll in Iran could be the same kind of outcome. And then obviously Greenland is going to be a similar, I think, outcome in that respect. He's going to use some form of legal framework and use their argument against them. He's not going to invade. That would be dumb. Like, he doesn't need to invade Greenland.
It's not his thing. I think Venezuela has demonstrated that it's just not his thing. He does short. If he does a military intervention, it's really, really short, very targeted, particular area, and then it's done. And he shouts a lot, and then people have been so trained and conditioned that he's a warmonger, he's a warmonger, whereas he really doesn't have that track record. Now he's a rule breaker, yes.
Yeah. Well, but the rules-based order is, San Francisco is an arc of tyranny on a global scale. Rules for thee, but not for me. So.
Now, Susan, why does Trump want Greenland? And there is this argument I've seen, and it must be true, by the way, this argument, because Trump only has nefarious intentions about this, there's some, I don't know, Ars Technica or something, having the Americas all together, and some technical vision.
Well, it is part of the Western Hemisphere, and Trump is pretty clear in terms of, the question of the Monroe Doctrine. But look at a map. Both in terms of the Arctic question, but I think it's even more interesting if you look at, what would happen if Greenland were a protectorate of the United States, part of the United States? Where does that put Canada? I mean, because it's right there between Europe and the United States. And Trump is basically, I think, tightening the noose. Think of the original Monroe Doctrine. The original Monroe Doctrine was basically saying we don't want empires in our hemisphere. And the empires of the day, of course, were the British, the French, and to obviously a large degree also the Spanish. Well, who are the empires today? Where do we have an empire in the Northern Hemisphere? Well, we have the drug empires in the Southern Hemisphere, which Trump is clearly taking care of. But where do we have the empire in the Northern Hemisphere? Canada, which is a dominion, where the king is still sovereign. I mean, every time I say that, people say, that's not true. That's not true. You know, just go look it up. The king is the sovereign in Canada, just like the king is the sovereign in Australia.
Canada has a viceroy?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's essentially what the prime minister is.
Right.
But, you know,
no, there's another office.
Is there one?
Yeah, there's a consul general or
governor
general, something like that.
Oh, and that's you know, you go back to the infamous situation in Australia back in the 1960s or 70s, Gough Whitlam.
Yeah, Whitlam,
yeah. When Whitlam went to nationalize Rio Tinto Zinc and the other, the other raw materials extracting companies, the consul general essentially delivered the message from the monarchy, you're out. Doesn't matter that the people of Australia voted for you, you're out. They don't do that very often, but they do have that power. So, you know, the empire that we're facing in the Western Hemisphere is Canada, and then you have Greenland, which it's true, it's under a monarchy. And, you know, look at the Danish, the Norwegian, the Swedish monarchies, and look at their interrelationship with the British monarchy. You know, these are not really just figureheads. I mean, there's that aspect to it. You know, there's a certain Hollywood soap opera element to the monarchies. You know, keep the people occupied with the soap opera and so on. But there are institutions tied to these things, financial, military intelligence, and so on. So Trump wants to free the Western Hemisphere along the lines of the Monroe Doctrine from empire. Well, there's two problems that I see. You know, one is Denmark, and one is Greenland, and one is Canada. I mean, obviously, there's the raw materials, there's the strategic positioning, and so on and so forth. But I think there's a deeper principle involved. And you look at Greenland. I mean, I looked it up while I was on a show the other day. I mean, its population is 57,000 people. There are medium-sized suburbs outside of Detroit that have more people than that. You know?
There are more students enrolled at the University of Florida in Gainesville than that.
There are twice as many people who go to a University of Michigan football game.
Exactly. To move off, to hand this over to Alex, this is to remind everybody that to understand Greenland is to understand a point that Alex first made ages ago, which is, hey, let's move the world around. Let's move the globe away from the Eurocentric version of the Atlantic Ocean, and let's look at it from the Arctic perspective. And then you'll see how important Greenland is. It's not very hard. So,
Alex?
Yeah, I also, this week, I learned another thing about Greenland, and apparently all the northern Arctic locations are very important for space technologies, because everywhere else things rotate, and if you go up north, you can have stationary, like the and so I don't understand exactly how that works. I didn't go deep into it, but I think somewhere online you can look up an interview with Pippa Malmgren. Yep. Who is apparently an expert on these things, and she explains it a bit more articulately than I just did. Although I thought I didn't do that badly.
Interestingly enough, Alex, what you're talking about is things like old Arthur C. Clarke's old ideas, the space elevator and whatnot, where you can go, where the stuff that doesn't, the areas of the, where things are geostatic, and you can just lift stuff directly. It's so much easier to lift against the gravity well mechanically than it is using rockets and all the rest of that stuff. So, which is that math is just terrible. Just trust me on the math is awful, and if you don't think so, you should go play Kerbal Space Program or something like that, and you'll learn very quickly how bad the
Alex. any more on Greenland and NATO and
No,
Denmark?
well, I think that
respond?
Trump is going to take Greenland one way or another, and they will try to take it in the least disruptive way possible. I think that paying off the 57,000 Greenlanders is probably going to be part of that, to make sure that the people there are happy and that nobody objects, or just a few object. And the Danish are going to have to suck it in, and the Europeans are going to have to just read the writing on the wall. They don't matter. And the world is shifting away. Europe is becoming the periphery. And the center of gravity of the world affairs is moving east. And guess what? The United States is right there. They have Alaska. They're connected to Russia. All these predictions that Spirit of Alaska is dead and this Bering Strait tunnel is never going to happen. I think that people are overreacting. I think all of that is going to happen.
Yes.
Okay.
The other point on this is that at the end of the day, I don't even think the Danes are the ones who are complaining most about Trump targeting Greenland. The most vociferous opposition to Trump taking Greenland is coming out of the UK, France, Germany, right? And everybody else. It's not the Danes. The Danes know that this is a negotiation. And why wouldn't they? Why can't the United States, buy Greenland for all intents and purposes? Why can't we do it? The truth of the matter is that at the end of the day, this is mob boss politics. I've been saying it for a long time, and he's going to make the Danes an offer they can't refuse.
But why would the British and the French and the Germans object?
Because the Greenland is the key to the sea routes that connect Europe to North America through Canada, and their play to put Mark Carney, their boy, in charge of Canada to start to control those natural resources, will then have to go through Trump's Navy. Again, goes all the way back to stuff that Alex and I were talking about all last summer. I started seeing the writing on the wall that Trump was arrogating power in Italy, Greece, the whole northern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, moving all the NATO military assets into Greece, into Italy, and trying to fortify that coast, as well as make good with the Russians and then target Greenland. And that shuts off, and Gibraltar. I know he wanted that as well, which is why Keir Starmer handed Gibraltar back to the Spanish. Right, he did that on purpose. The minute that started to happen, that was one of the first things Starmer did when he came back into power. Same thing with trying to give up the Chagos Islands. Right, they are trying desperately to figure out ways to counter the moves that the Americans can and will make. And it's, again, you have to think about things in the way the British see the world geographically, which is all about the maritime sea routes. Because at the end of the day, ships are harder to interdict than, and whatnot, than it is to blow up a pipeline or blow up a rail line or something like that to control the flow of goods and services around the world. So you have to think of naval power really is a very important thing, which is why we need to talk about Greenland in the context of Canada, and we have to talk about heavy sour oil as well in this entire conversation, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I'll turn the microphone back over to Susan or Alex.
Yeah, but it also speaks of Britain's legacy, because it built its power on the maritime routes,
of course,
and being able to control them, and that's how it operates. But one of the things that happened today, we're recording this on Friday, the 9th of January. It's 21:24 right now, UK time. Is Starmer saying that he's going to ban X or do something to restrict X, and then the US have responded. Lena Paul or Paulina?
Anna Paulina Luna.
Yeah,
or
that's it.
Has said that
we're gonna, if they do that, we will impose sanctions. And you already have Ofcom in the UK and Digital Services Act in the European Union telling American companies what they can and can't say. And there's a great lawyer, Preston Byrne. I follow him on X. He's so funny. He is so funny.
He is
posting tweets like, the British should realize that we've been independent of them since 1776. If they want to tell us how to what we can or can't say, they need to land troops on our shores.
Feeling froggy, take that lead. Yeah,
that's right. Susan, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that the more that you see real resistance to their policies, the fact that Trump got back into power is reshaping the world, is kicking over the rules-based order chessboard. It just means that, people like the British, the Europeans, they have to come out more in the open and show what their real face is, which is they're not Democrats. They're basically dictators. Well, it's really what I've been thinking about this, because there's a figure that I'm sure you guys are familiar with, but when you think about a number of the things that are happening, the way that they're always messing with the Mideast, or the way they're moving in terms of these kinds of fascist impositions, it suddenly popped into my mind Samuel P. Huntington. Because Huntington is famous more recently for the whole clash of civilizations idea, the fact that there's an inevitable clash between us and the Muslims, and and that's the new enemy image in the world. But if you go back to the 1960s, Samuel Huntington wrote something, and I can't remember if it was under the CFR or whether it was Project Democracy. No, that's more recent. I can't quite remember the names of it. But he actually wrote something where there comes a point where you have to essentially move with fascism with a democratic face. And I don't know if he used those words, but other people around the CFR did. Where you're, it's basically, it's fascist policies sort of in a velvet glove, but it's not so velvet anymore in terms of what's going on in Great Britain, in terms of freedom of speech, people being arrested for whatever, thrown in jail for years because, I guess they don't want to say he, she, or something like that. But, it's sort of the final phase of an imperial system where they're reaching the point where the only way they're going to be able to survive, whether it's by extracting more out of the population or imposing their policies on other nations, is where they just come out in their full fascist regalia. And that's really what you're beginning to see, which is, I always get a little short-tempered, because so much of the MAGA movement goes into its default option of socialism and communism. Give me a break. Socialism and communism doesn't feed insurance cartels. It doesn't feed these giant conglomerates and supranational institutions. This is corporatism. This is fascism, economically. So we've had it economically for a while, and then when people start to resist it, or there's some force out there like Trump, which is putting the brakes on these policies, then you drop the democratic face side of it. Yeah. And I think that's what that's what we're seeing in Europe at this point. We would have seen it in the United States if Trump hadn't been reelected.
Agreed. No, interestingly enough, I'm going to say, if any of us grew up in Central or South America in the 1970s, right, and as opposed to growing up where we did, not where we did. Dexter White and I talk about this all the time. We'd have both been Che Guevara wearing T-shirt wearing lefties, because that's the natural antipode to the system that was in place there. Okay, so it would make perfect sense. So I don't begrudge, for example, anybody with that kind of leftist anti-imperialist imprinting. I don't. I just happen to think that they haven't updated their software, that Trump is a different thing than that, and that's the biggest problem, the biggest hurdle that many of the commentators in the space are having a problem adjusting to. And maybe they're just they don't want to believe that it could be changing and fair. Okay, we've all got abuse here. We've all got experience and sadness and disappointment and everything else over the last course of our over the course of our lives. But at the same time, like, living in that universe is soul crushing. Wouldn't you want to get on board with the idea that maybe if you give this guy the chance to do the right thing, and you support him, and you give him the political power by your affirmation of what he's doing, then he can move mountains because he can't move mountains without you. And so you're sabotaging the world you want by being overly cynical. That's where my position is.
I think, Tom, that if Che Guevara was alive by any chance today, he would be a Trump supporter. And I'm not even, it's not even a joke, you know, because Che Guevara, there's a famous quote where he said, "I envy you, North Americans. You are predestined for the most important fight of all because you live in the belly of the beast." He understood how the terrain was laid out, and he knew what the real fight was. And I think that today Trump is fighting this fight. It's just that I think that for most people out there, it's very difficult to recognize this. So they would think, that Che Guevara and Trump would be ideological opposites, but they're not really. They lived in different times. They acted in different circles. Che Guevara went into a hopeless fight that was suicidal. Trump went inside of the system and made himself one of them. Which is what you would do if you were, for example, an undercover cop taking down the mob.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't start shooting at their low-level employees. You would try to make yourself a trusted member of their circles.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can take them down. So I think that, you're right. This is the same fight. And I think that Che Guevara would recognize, not that I'm a fan, he
none of us
people, but he was killed by the CIA. And yes, the CIA killed JFK, and they would like to kill Donald Trump, and so it's the same fault lines.
Interestingly, Alex, when you say all this, and I've made this point before, and as a New Yorker, an Italian New Yorker, half of my family from Queens, half of my family from Brooklyn, none of my family from Manhattan, and understand that these are an immigrant family no less. I know in effect I can understand Donald Trump because remember he's from Queens. Queens, for those of you not New York, that's not Manhattan. That might as well be, Cincinnati, as far as Manhattan is concerned. And I know it's right over the freaking Triborough Bridge, but that doesn't matter, folks. You got to understand these are two completely different worlds. So Trump was never really accepted by these people. He's always had that chip on his shoulder. So never forget that. So actually, that was a point that was reminded. I was having lunch with a friend of mine this afternoon. He reminded me of that talking point that I've been talking about this for years. He reminded me of that point this morning when we were having lunch.
So he's not like other politicians. He doesn't do statecraft, as we mentioned in the other video. And then also, if people want to get an idea of what Trump wants to cause, check out the video that I did on Ibrahim Traore, and what he's causing in Burkina Faso. And then what I wanted to do is talk about NATO, or the impact on NATO on this, because I have this notion that at some point, notion, hope, belief, please, dear God, he's going to either seriously weaken NATO or leave NATO. That would be consistent. But what's the effect? And I want to bring Alex in. Alex, if you want to say something
first that, then that
about this Greenland play on NATO, because Alex,
sorry,
he might be hungry.
He
sorry,
wants to feed his not to feed his kids.
You just assumed that I was going to take that ball, but that's fine. Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah,
I was saying about NATO
and the play on Greenland.
What's the impact on NATO of this play for Greenland?
I don't know exactly, but I think that NATO is destined for the garbage bin of history where it belongs. Mm-hmm. It's NATO should never have come into existence. Mm-hmm. NATO was created by Great Britain as on the basis of their agenda to attack and destroy Russia. That same obsession. That's why they created NATO in 1948, 2 years after Winston Churchill's Fulton speech. Suddenly designating the Soviet Union as an enemy, even though a year before that, together, supposedly together, they took down the biggest scourge of humanity, Nazi Germany and Hitler, right? Mm-hmm. And Russia did between 80 and 90% of that heavy lifting. And so Russia should have been an honored friend and an ally, but the British immediately turned them into an enemy and created a NATO as a military bloc to build it up slowly through over the decades in order to do exactly what they're doing now. They militarized, Nazified Ukraine, and then started funneling all the NATO arms technologies, weaponry, training to Ukrainians to volunteer as the cannon fodder to fight Russia for them. This is why the NATO even came into existence. So it belongs in the trash heap of history, and that's where it's going. How Greenland might catalyze this event, I'm not exactly sure, but let's see. Trump might even try to reform NATO or splinter it or isolate certain countries, empower other countries. I don't know. We'll see. There may be a plan that we don't know about,
Yeah, I think there is.
Yeah, when you go back to what you were saying about Winston Churchill, I think it's really, I love to do this because it sets a lot of my MAGA friends' hair on fire. Go back to Franklin Roosevelt and Roosevelt's discussions with Churchill at the end of World War II, where he was very, very clear. We did not fight that war to reestablish British 18th century methods. That was a quote of Roosevelt to Churchill at the Casablanca summit. And, Churchill got red in the face. What do you mean by that? And what Roosevelt said is the British 18th century system is something which takes more out of a country than it puts back in.
Yeah.
And with American methods of investment, water, technology, he's pointing to the map with the desert where they are in Northern Africa. We can develop these countries, they can be self-sufficient and so on. Roosevelt's intention for the post-war period, and again, hi, MAGA friends, I know you're going to freak out, was work with the Soviet Union, which, remember, had only been communist at that point for hardly 20, 25, less than 30 years. So it was not a thoroughly entrenched system, and it certainly wasn't beloved, probably by most of the Russian people. I mean, they rallied to Mother Russia in World War II, as one would expect. But to work with the Soviet Union, to work with China, which was not communist, right, at that time. And his idea of the United Nations was a place where you could take those sovereign nations, line them up with other sovereign nations against the empires, against the British Empire, French Empire, Dutch Empire, especially. And he died before the war ended. And instead, you ended up with Winston Churchill's world.
Yeah.
Where you redefine the Russians, the Soviets as enemy number one, and that has defined the entire post-war period. Everything that anybody who has been born since World War II has lived through, every war, every disaster has been a function of that world which was put in place by the Fulton, Missouri speech. And what people have to get into their heads is Donald Trump is taking down that world.
Yes.
That's what people don't understand.
Susan,
last words, because we need to finish up.
Yeah, this is really quick. This is something that just popped into my head last night. Sure. I'm going to leave it on an open question. Roosevelt dies in what, April 1945?
Mm-hmm.
When did Patton die?
I don't remember.
I think these two events are not unrelated. I was chatting with Jan Burlingame last night in text, and he reminded me he was like, he just popped into my head, boyo. I think that's what he called me. He does that. He's hilarious. These two guys, Eisenhower and Patton, they were looking to take down the old system. And Eisenhower and Patton, had he lived, we may have been in a much, much, much different world. Because Eisenhower, by that time, was finally beginning to realize that, while George was a political liability, he understood the game board for what it was. And if you read between the lines in Eisenhower's memoirs and whatnot, you begin to realize when you put all of that together that it's almost like, look, we understand what the problem is here. And I'm going to leave it at that. That may not be a good read. It may or may not be the right read, but certainly Eisenhower, I think, was thinking in these terms. Whether Patton was or not is a different story.
Well, the other
but it's
person
very
who was MacArthur, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we put all of these things together, and what we have is it's very clear that if, it's correct that effectively Roosevelt was killed no differently than McKinley, Lincoln, yada, yada, yada. They tried to kill Reagan, failed. They tried to kill Trump, failed. They got Kennedy. What if they got Patton as well? They took the most brilliant military commander of the 20th century off the game board.
Very interesting.
Because all you have to do is send Patton on the right mission, and it would have been taken care of. And mythologizing of Patton is one thing. I'm a huge fan of that myth, but I think it's real because they understood that in that time, he and Eisenhower both understood. Watched a really great video about this last night. That they understood.
We're gonna have to finish.
I know.
Up. I think last
point, then I'll let it go. Which is that they understood that the tank was the key to modern warfare for the 20th century, and it was Patton who proved it in World War II. And then we stopped doing war after World War II for a variety of reasons. Now,
yes,
ask yourself these questions as to why.
Yes.
Just going to leave it there. There you go.
Asking questions is a really, really good idea. That's what we all need to do. It's what everybody needs to do. Ask questions and also comment and subscribe and like and follow these three. I'll have the links in the description below. And what I appreciate about all three of you, and I think the people who watch our videos and watch your videos separately and on other channels appreciate is the way that you guys dig in, not content with the superficial. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Tom. Look forward to doing this again in about a month's time. And of course, you guys are going to appear independently on this channel on other occasions. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Great weekend to everyone.
Thank you.